Welcome to the channel where history speaks louder than fiction. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, because every week, we uncover the stories the world tried to bury. Drop a comment, tell us where you're watching from, and what time it is as you hear this voice. Let's see who's tuning in from the farthest corner of the world. Today, we're traveling back to one of the most paranoid and explosive moments in pre-Civil War America. A time when fear became more powerful than truth, and hysteria spread like wildfire. This is the Texas slave insurrection panic of 1860. It was July. The Texas sun hung heavy in the sky, a dry, suffocating heat that baked the land. And then, fire. Not one fire, but dozens. Blazing through the small town of Dallas, devouring stores, homes, and churches. By the time the embers cooled, the town was gone, burned to the ground. No one knew how it started. But fear always needs a target. Within hours, whispers began to spread. It was the slaves. They're rising up. They've set Texas on fire. Those whispers would become accusations. Accusations became confessions, forced and false. And within weeks, that fear would consume an entire state. This wasn't a rebellion. It was the fear of one. To understand the Texas slave insurrection panic of 1860, we have to go back to a decade before the flames, before the fear, before the Civil War tore the country apart. Because Texas was a world of contradictions. A young state, barely 2 decades old, built on ambition and slavery. By 1860, Texas was home to nearly 180,000 enslaved African Americans. They made up roughly 30% of the state's population. But their presence was everywhere, in the cotton fields of the East, on cattle ranches that stretched for miles, and in the booming little towns that were still carving themselves out of the wilderness. The enslaved weren't just field hands. They were blacksmiths, carpenters, cooks, and seamstresses. They built the homes, the fences, the wagons, and even the churches where their owners worshipped. For many of them, freedom wasn't a dream, it was a rumor. A whisper that drifted across the fields, passed from traveler to traveler, like smoke in the wind. Some had heard of men escaping north through a mysterious network of safe houses. Others heard stories of uprisings in places far away, Nat Turner in Virginia, the revolt in Haiti. Every whisper was a spark of hope. But in Texas, hope was a dangerous thing. The white settlers knew it too. Many of them were newcomers, migrants from Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, bringing with them their families, their faith, and their fears. They had left behind worn-out lands and came west with the promise of endless opportunity. But to make that opportunity real, they brought slaves, the human engines of their dreams. And with them came the one thing they couldn't leave behind, paranoia. For the institution of slavery to survive, fear had to exist on both sides. The enslaved feared the lash, the auction block, the endless toil. The enslavers feared something even more haunting, revenge. They remembered what had happened in Haiti, when the enslaved rose and overthrew their masters. They remembered Nat Turner's rebellion, when dozens of white families were killed in Virginia in 1831. That single event had terrified the South for decades. So when settlers came to Texas, they carried that memory like a loaded gun, ready to fire at the first sign of unrest. In the small towns of Texas, Dallas, Denton, Waxahachie, and Tyler, enslaved men and women lived side by side with their white owners, often on small farms rather than massive plantations. This closeness made life unpredictable. An enslaved man might fix the very tools that chained him. A woman might cook the meals that fed her oppressor's family. They saw, heard, and understood far more than their masters believed. And among them, there was quiet communication. Songs, prayers, coded language, hidden ways to speak of freedom without speaking the word. Meanwhile, the white townspeople grew increasingly restless. The 1850s had been a decade of chaos, the nation itself was splitting apart. Newspapers from the North spoke loudly against slavery, while those from the South called the abolitionists terrorists. Texas newspapers warned of abolitionist agents, Northern men, often preachers or merchants, accused of sneaking into Texas to stir up the slaves. They wrote about imaginary conspiracies, pamphlets hidden in wagons, coded letters, whispers of black uprisings. The Austin State Gazette, one of the most influential papers in Texas, published warnings of plots and infiltrators. One editorial even claimed that abolition preachers were arming slaves and teaching them how to revolt. None of it was true, but truth mattered less than fear. Fear sells papers. Fear fills church pews. And fear justifies control. By 1859, this fear was thick in the Texas air. The hanging of John Brown, the white abolitionist who led a failed revolt at Harper's Ferry, had terrified the South. He had tried to arm enslaved men to rise against their masters. To many Texans, John Brown's ghost was everywhere. In their barns, in their slave quarters, in the shadows at night. One Texas newspaper wrote, "There are invisible hands at work, enemies among us, pretending friendship, but plotting destruction." And so, the stage was set. A land already dry and hot, where fear and rumor were the sparks waiting to catch. All it would take was a single match, a single unexplained fire, to turn rumor into rage. And in July of 1860, that match would finally strike. A store in downtown Dallas would go up in flames. And when the smoke cleared, the people of Texas wouldn't see a natural disaster. They would see an enemy that didn't exist. And in their minds, that enemy had to be destroyed. It was Sunday, July 8, 1860. The kind of summer day Texas is famous for, air so hot it ripples above the ground like glass. In the quiet frontier town of Dallas, a handful of buildings made up the heart of the community. A few churches, a blacksmith's forge, a general store, and homes, all built of dry pine, tightly packed together beneath the open sky. The people of Dallas had gathered for church that morning. By noon, smoke began to rise from the center of town. At first, just a wisp. Then a curl. Then a blaze. A fire had broken out in W. Peek's General Store, one of the busiest spots in Dallas. The flames spread fast, leaping from rooftop to rooftop, fueled by wind and wood and fear. Within minutes, the entire downtown was engulfed. By evening, every business in Dallas was gone. The courthouse. The stores. The church. Reduced to ash. When the smoke cleared the next morning, the survivors stood among the ruins, their faces covered in soot, their eyes red, the town silent except for the sound of collapsing timbers. It should have ended there, as tragedy often does, with grief, loss, and rebuilding. But that summer, Texas was not a place where logic survived for long. Because in a land already haunted by fear, every mystery demands a culprit. The day after the fire, whispers began to ripple through the townsfolk. It wasn't an accident. Someone said it. They did it on purpose. Soon, the whispers took shape, given life by fear. It was the slaves. They're rising up. They've planned to burn every town in Texas. No proof. No witnesses. Just suspicion, passed from mouth to mouth until it became truth. Local newspapers, hungry for attention, fanned the flames. The Dallas Herald published an article blaming abolitionist conspirators, men from the North who had supposedly snuck into Texas to arm the enslaved and incite rebellion. Within days, the Austin State Gazette echoed the claim, warning that Texas was the next Harper's Ferry. They said the fires weren't random. They were signals, coordinated by black conspirators and their white abolitionist allies. The evidence? None. But when fear speaks, evidence isn't required. Within a week, the panic spread like wildfire itself. From Dallas, it rode south to Waxahachie, east to Tyler, west to Weatherford, and north to Denton. Towns hundreds of miles apart began reporting strange fires, barn roofs catching light, smoke in the distance, even a lantern knocked over in the wind was now proof of a vast conspiracy. People began searching for signs, coded messages, strange footprints, a missing tool, a whisper at night. Each new rumor became a spark, each suspicion another flame. And in a matter of days, Texas was burning with fear. Local leaders began organizing vigilance committees, groups of armed men sworn to protect their communities from revolt. But protection quickly turned into punishment. In the small town of Pilot Point, a black man was questioned for carrying a box of matches. He was beaten until he confessed to a crime that never happened. In Waxahachie, another man was accused of speaking in secret with others after sundown. He was hanged the next morning, without trial. Every confession forced from pain became another proof to feed the hysteria. The panic spread even faster than the truth could run. Letters poured into newspapers from across the state, letters filled with imaginary warnings. A full insurrection is planned for the 4th of August. Our slaves have been seen gathering weapons. A white man from the north has been found distributing poison. None of it was true. But in the echo chamber of fear, truth no longer mattered. By mid-July, the Texas press had declared war, not on an enemy that existed, but on one they had invented. The Dallas Herald warned that abolitionist infiltrators were among them. The Austin State Gazette urged citizens to arm themselves, root out traitors, and defend Texas honor. Other papers reprinted these stories word for word, each time more dramatic than before. By the time the news reached eastern Texas, the message was clear. The slaves were rebelling. And anyone, could be a conspirator. Groups of armed men began riding from plantation to plantation, demanding to know who was loyal and who was not. They searched slave quarters, barns, even wells. Men were dragged out at night. Some were tortured with fire until they gave up names of other enslaved people, neighbors, even white preachers who had once spoken against cruelty. Many of those names were made up under pain, but once written, they became law. And law in those days often arrived on horseback. Bodies were found hanging from oak trees at dawn. Dozens across the state, maybe more. No records were kept. No trials. Just fear, written in blood and ash. The irony is, there was no plan. No rebellion. No uprising. The fires that destroyed Dallas were caused by nothing more sinister than the Texas heat and unstable phosphorus matches, common in the 19th century. But once people decided it was an insurrection, no truth could undo the lie. Because paranoia is contagious. It spreads quietly, invisibly. And once it's in the air, it consumes everything. Fear became the law of the land. And for the enslaved, that meant no safety, no justice, only survival. By the end of July, Texas was a state under siege, not from rebels, but from its own imagination. Dozens of enslaved men had been killed. White travelers were lynched as abolitionist spies. Entire towns operated under curfew. And then, just as the panic seemed to reach its peak, one rumor changed everything. Someone claimed to have found letters. Letters written by northern abolitionists, proof, they said, that Texas was under attack. Those letters would ignite the next phase of the hysteria. And this time, there would be no turning back. If you're still watching right now, you've seen how fast fear can spread, and how quickly truth can die. Before we go deeper, subscribe. Because the next part of this story is where everything begins to spiral out of control. The summer of 1860 had turned Texas into a furnace. The air was dry enough to splinter wood, and every horizon shimmered like molten glass. But underneath that heat, something else was burning. Not in the fields. In the minds of men. Rumors began to spread through the small towns and cotton fields, whispers that enslaved people were plotting a coordinated uprising. That they were preparing to torch the plantations, assassinate their masters, and bring an end to slavery in one explosive rebellion. No evidence was presented. No proof was found. But fear needed no evidence. Letters circulated between white settlers. Newspapers, many under the control of secessionist editors, published alarming headlines. They claimed that northern abolitionists had sent men south to arm enslaved people and ignite the countryside. Each article sounded more certain than the last, even though every claim was made of smoke and imagination. Then, on a blistering July night, the first fires began. Warehouses. General stores. Even churches. In Dallas, Denton, and Pilot Point, flames swallowed entire blocks, painting the night sky in orange and black. Within hours, the panic spread faster than the fires themselves. Citizens were convinced it was proof of rebellion, a grand insurrection had begun. And soon, paranoia turned neighbor against neighbor. If you're still here, listening to this, you're part of the few who crave truth, not rumor. Before we continue deeper into this story, do one small thing. Subscribe and turn on the bell icon, because what comes next is one of the most chilling domino effects in American history. A chain reaction built entirely from fear, fire, and falsehoods. And if you're not subscribing, I'll ask you one question: why not? Is the past too uncomfortable to face, or are you ready to confront it? Because from this point onward, everything begins to spiral out of control. By mid-July, committees of safety formed across Texas. Men patrolled roads with rifles, interrogated travelers, and searched wagons for weapons or northern pamphlets. Every enslaved person became a suspect. Every stranger, a spy. White settlers began arresting enslaved men at random, forcing confessions under torture. Some were whipped until they spoke names. Others were hanged before they could even be questioned. In the small town of Waxahachie, a preacher's barn caught fire. Before dawn, 3 enslaved men were executed. No evidence. No trial. In Gainesville, in Denton, in Weatherford, the panic spread like wildfire. Every new rumor birthed another execution. Every burned field became another proof of a non-existent conspiracy. The newspapers fanned the flames further. They called it the Great Texas Slave Insurrection. They claimed it was orchestrated by Northern abolitionists, secretly collaborating with enslaved people to destroy the South from within. Fear had become a weapon. And that weapon was being used to justify unspeakable cruelty. By the end of July, dozens of innocent people were dead. Men were lynched in public squares. Some white abolitionist preachers vanished entirely, their names never recorded again. And still, the fires burned. Even when lightning, not rebellion, was the true cause. The world didn't need truth that summer. It only needed someone to blame. And the truth was the next casualty of the panic. By late July of 1860, Texas was no longer a place of reason. It was a landscape of suspicion. A state choking on smoke, fear, and vengeance. The fires that scorched Dallas, Denton, and Pilot Point were long extinguished. But the blaze that burned in men's minds was only getting started. Local vigilance committees, self-appointed bands of white settlers, began to travel from town to town, declaring themselves protectors of the South. They didn't wear badges. They didn't need proof. All they needed was a rumor. In Waxahachie, in Gainesville, in Decatur, the story was always the same. A whisper. An accusation. Then a rope thrown over a branch before sunset. The number of hangings grew by the day. In Dallas County alone, dozens of enslaved men were executed. Each accused of participating in a plot that never existed. In nearby towns, white abolitionist preachers and northern-born teachers were dragged from their homes, beaten, and lynched beside the very people they had once tried to educate. No one was safe from the hysteria. Even the slightest connection to northern ideals could get a man killed. Texas newspapers called it justice. But history would call it what it truly was. A massacre born from imagination. The Dallas Herald printed names of suspected conspirators, encouraging citizens to take action where courts cannot. This wasn't law. It was theater, and the stage was soaked in blood. By August, the panic had consumed more than just towns. It had infected the state's very soul. White Texans began to believe that abolitionism itself was an act of war. And so, they turned inward. Toward secession. Toward rebellion. Toward the Confederate dream. The Texas slave insurrection panic didn't end with the fires or the hangings. Its true legacy was political. It became the justification Texas leaders needed to claim that their society was under siege. That the North had infiltrated their lands. And that slavery must be defended at all costs. In the months that followed, Texas joined the march toward civil war. The hysteria of 1860 hardened into ideology. And what began as smoke and rumor soon became an army's battle cry. The true rebellion never came from the enslaved. It came from those who feared them. When the smoke cleared over Texas in the late summer of 1860, nothing looked the same. Entire towns were charred, families divided, and a silent fear still lingered in the air, a fear that had already claimed far more lives than any uprising ever did. In the months that followed, a few investigators quietly began to examine the evidence. What they found was devastating in its simplicity. The fires were not the work of rebellion. They were caused by spontaneous combustion, the result of new phosphorus matches igniting in the brutal Texas heat. No organized plot. No insurrection. Just science, misunderstood by terror. But by the time that truth emerged, it no longer mattered. More than 100 people, enslaved and free, had been executed without trial. Communities had been torn apart. And the state's newspapers never corrected the story. Instead, they turned the panic into propaganda. They used it as proof that slavery was under attack. And that secession from the Union was the only path to safety. When Texas voted to secede in early 1861, many of the men raising their hands remembered that summer. The fires, the fear, the imagined rebellion. It had become their justification, their wound, their myth. The Texas slave insurrection panic didn't just kill the innocent. It helped kill the truth, and paved the road to civil war. Across the South, other states would repeat the pattern. Fear leading to fury. Rumor leading to war. And long after the guns fell silent, the echo of 1860 still lingered. A reminder that sometimes, history's loudest explosions begin not with a shot, but with a whisper. History often remembers battles and victories. But rarely the fear that came before them. The Texas slave insurrection panic of 1860 wasn't born from rebellion. It was born from imagination. From fear. From men who mistook thunder for footsteps and lightning for war. In the end, no one rebelled. No uprising ever came. And yet, dozens were dead. Thousands terrified. And an entire state was pushed one step closer to secession. Not because of what was true, but because of what people believed. If this story moved you, if it made you stop and think about how fear can rewrite history, then don't leave just yet. Take a moment. Subscribe. Turn on that notification bell. Not for me, but for the stories that deserve to be heard, the ones buried under smoke, rumor, and silence. And if you're not subscribing, tell me why in the comments below. Was this story too dark? Too real? Or did it make you see the past, and the present, a little differently? Drop your thoughts below. What part of this story struck you the hardest? What moment made you stop and question what fear can make people do? Because history doesn't disappear. It waits. In ashes. In echoes. In stories like this, waiting for someone brave enough to listen.